Japan is facing a really big question, a high-stakes debate about its entire economic future. The central issue? Should it put its own interests first, even if that means other countries get hurt in the process? Today, we're going to dive deep into this very question.
So here it is, the core of the whole thing. Is a Japan-first approach actually the right path forward? I mean, this really challenges decades of economic thinking. It forces us to ask what role Japan should even play in a world that's getting more and more competitive. So let's break down the arguments, shall we? All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get the lay of the land, the context of this whole debate. Then we'll lay out the case for a Japan-first strategy. And right after that, we'll hear the arguments for sticking with global cooperation. We'll see exactly where these two sides clash, and then finally, we'll look at the verdict from an actual debate on this topic and try to figure out what it all means. Okay, so let's set the stage. Why is this debate even happening right now? Well, it's because Japan is at a critical turning point, and it's facing some serious long-term challenges that just aren't going away.
For decades, Japan's economy has been stuck in what some people call a triple distress. You've got this stubborn deflation that just suffocates growth. Then there's the aging population and a shrinking workforce. That's a huge problem. And on top of it all, there's this feeling that its competitive edge on the world stage, which was once the envy of the entire world, is starting to slip. This tough reality is really forcing a hard look at some pretty unconventional ideas.
Now, the policy at the heart of all this is called a beggar thy neighbor policy. It's a pretty provocative name, right? But the idea itself is actually pretty simple. It's when a country tries to solve its own economic problems with policies, like, say, restricting imports or deliberately weakening its currency, that, they end up making things worse for other countries. So the big question is this a legitimate strategy for survival, or is it just a really dangerous game?
So let's start with the arguments for this Japan-first approach. The people who support this, they don't see it as an attack on other countries. For them, it's an absolutely necessary act of self-preservation. First up, they argue that the global economy isn't some friendly neighborhood competition. It's more like an economic war. And in that kind of environment, leaving your markets wide open to a flood of cheap imports is just, it's a recipe for disaster. They say that protecting your own industries, especially manufacturing, is absolutely essential to save jobs and to hold on to Japan's technological backbone. The second point is all about breaking free from that deflationary spiral. The thinking goes like this. If you make your currency cheaper, your exports suddenly become a lot more attractive to other countries. More exports mean bigger corporate profits, which in theory should lead to higher wages and more investment right here at home. This could be the spark that finally gets the engine of Japan's domestic economy running again.
And finally, they make a really pragmatic point. They say, hey, just look around. The economic giants, like the US and China, are already playing this game with tariffs and subsidies. So if Japan tries to be the good guy and stick to these pure free trade principles, it's just going to get steamrolled. It's about being a realist, not being naive.
Proponents are pretty clear that they don't see this as a permanent wall around Japan. They frame it as a running start. Think of it like a temporary shield, something that gives struggling Japanese companies the time and the breathing room they need to get back on their feet and regain their strength before they have to jump back into that fierce global race.
Okay, but of course, that's only half the story. There's a really powerful counterargument here. So let's flip it around and look at the other side. The case for sticking with global cooperation.
Their biggest fear? Isolation. It's simple. If Japan starts putting up walls, other countries are going to put up their own walls in retaliation. This could easily spiral into a full-blown trade war, which would be just devastating for Japan, a country that relies so heavily on imports for essential things like energy and food. They warn that being seen as a selfish country could have really severe consequences down the line. The second argument is that this kind of protection is just a band-aid. It's a short-term fix that actually prevents real long-term solutions. You see, when you shield companies from competition, you take away their number one reason to innovate and become more efficient. They argue this leads to stagnation, not strength, and in the end, it actually makes the economy weaker. And hey, what about the average person? A weaker currency might be great for exporters, sure, but it makes everything that's imported, from the gas in your car to the food on your table, way more expensive. This directly hits the wallets of everyday Japanese consumers, lowering their purchasing power and making life harder, not easier.
And to illustrate their point, they use this incredibly powerful metaphor. They warn that easy protectionism creates a boiled frog state. You know the story. The frog is sitting in slowly warming water. It feels comfortable. It's completely unaware of the danger until it's just too late. In the same way, they say, protected industries lose that sense of crisis. They fail to adapt. And then one day they wake up and find they just can't compete at all.
So as you can see, we've got two completely different worldviews here. Let's really zero in on the core disagreement, the exact point where these two arguments collide.
Okay, so the core disagreement really boils down to this. How should Japan respond to the fact that other huge economies like the US and China are already being protectionist? The Japan First side says you've got to fight fire with fire. Use your own tariffs and measures as a negotiating card to force a fairer deal. But the global cooperation side says that's a game Japan just can't win. It can't match the scale of the US or China. It would totally backfire. They argue that instead of imitating them, Japan should lean into its real strengths, its global reputation for quality, and the international trust it's built over decades.
Now, this exact topic was recently put to the test in a formal debate. This wasn't just a theoretical exercise. So which side made the more compelling case? Let's take a look at the verdict. In the end, the judges came to a decision. They declared the winner to be the negative side. That's the side arguing for global cooperation and against a Japan First policy. So why did they win? Well, according to the judges, it really came down to a few key things. The negative side was just more effective at laying out the very specific, very real dangers of this path. The risk of trade wars, the risk of rising prices for consumers. In contrast, the Japan First side's plan for how to manage all those risks just felt a little too vague, a bit too abstract. Just calling it a negotiating card wasn't really enough. Ultimately, the argument for prioritizing long-term international trust won out over the appeal of some quick, short-term gains.
But look, a debate verdict doesn't magically solve the problem. The challenges that Japan is facing are very real, and the appeal of putting your own country first is always going to be powerful. So after hearing both sides of the coin, the question isn't just for the debaters. It's really for all of us. In a world this interconnected, what does it truly mean to put a nation first? What do you think is the right path for Japan?